favorite, whatever effect you want to bring about. It may be to persuade, it may be to convince people of an argument, it may be to say something outrageous, it may be just to make people laugh. But language is an effective instrument to doing all of that and more. And to my mind, that's very important. So I think, I know that I've got this completely sort of inflated reputation as some sort of vocabularists. I mean, when you first suggested this book, my question in my mind was, do I really want to sort of reinforce this cliched image of me as some sort of etymological egghead, and this sort of MP who's more concerned with words than anything else? It's not true. I'm only concerned with words because they're my instruments. In politics, to my mind, are about ideas, and ideas are about words. So how can a politician be indifferent to words? That was my logic. But having said that, the book does have that message that, you know, use words and use them to effect and for a purpose and in a way that actually gives you the results that you seek. That's the broad underlying thrust of what I'm trying to do.
You make a very specific point when you say, people come to you and say, teach us some new words. What is your response?
My response is, my favorite word is a four-letter word, read. Because ultimately, as I explained to you earlier, that's how I acquired my words, and I think anybody will acquire whatever vocabulary they need by just reading, and that's what's essential, is to get into the habit of reading. It distresses me when I see young people today, and there are quite a few young people who are old enough to have kids of their own, and the kids tend to think, very frankly, that books are all about school and classroom work and homework. They're a chore, they're a burden, they're an obligation, they're not a source of pleasure. And that, to my mind, is a huge mistake because, in fact, they are, to my mind, principally a source of pleasure, and pleasure is what should really, really matter. To my mind, if children realize how much joy they can get out of coming across words in a book, it might be a very different experience for them than seeing books only as text. The irony is, of course, kids are reading, but they're reading off a mobile screen. They're probably not reading enough. They're not reading very good prose or very good text, but they're reading. So that if they can know how to read, they should really enjoy the process of the mind-expanding, mental horizon-expanding experience of reading more than just off a screen.
But don't you also argue that reading skills are the foundation for full participation in the economic, political, cultural life of contemporary society?
Yeah.
So how does that work besides, you know, just entertainment?
Because in any society, the language of that society, or in our case, the languages of our society, are indispensable tools to taking command of your own destiny within that society. I mean, you know, you have to fill in forms all the time for one thing, so that you know that the written word already fits into the governmental system. But there's also the fact that if you actually look at the way in which language is used by our rulers to communicate certain ideas and convictions, you ought to have the capacity to either absorb, deflect, or reflect on the language that's being thrust at you. You need language back to express your own agreement or disagreement. You need language to be able to deal with everything. The economy, yes, because the decisions you make have to be well informed, and information comes to you through language. If it's a question of social change, how are you aware of what goes on in other countries? You read about them, and then that brings you the insights to be able to say what kind of changes you would like to see in our own society. And of course, in politics, as I say, language and words are indispensable for political ideas. So in all those areas, economic, social, cultural, political, words, language, indispensable.
Okay, coming back to the fun aspect of the book, and I hope you'll read a little later so that, you know, you give us a flavor of what's in it. You talk about words fostering a sense of belonging and between all those who you know, love them. There's a specific word you use, which is milver. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, milver has got the great merit of being the only word a poet can use to rhyme with silver. Can any of you think of any other word that rhymes with silver? There isn't, right? The word milver was invented by an American essayist and critic in the early years of the 20th century, because he said there is no English word that exists to describe a person who is enthusiastic about the same thing as you are enthusiastic about. And so he felt co-enthusiast or fellow fan, which are the only alternatives, were too cumbersome or just not appealing enough. And so he invented the word milver, and not very clear what the etymology of it is, what the origins of it are, but he says that one needs to have a word to describe relationships that lovers of books and words have with other lovers of books and words. So I've written in the book that I think my father was probably my milver, but the truth is that it's an epitome in some ways of the boundless possibilities that come when you explore language. You can even create new words just for fun. You can delve into words and wordplay, and it's a reminder of the endlessly inventive human capacity. Every year, some dictionary will be issuing a list of new words of the year, because those words have been coined by people in the course of the year, and they've been accepted into sufficient usage in English that they're put into these dictionaries. Or if you're looking at something like the rights of children and young people in every society to create their own slang, to create terms that mean something only to them and not to others, that's normal. I think when you have the occasional disapproving teacher who wants you to be very, very strict and stick to Wren and Martin or whatever catechism of grammar they want to impose on you, I think you're actually doing a disservice to the endless possibilities that words offer and represent.
Okay, so this book is a book that rewards dipping into. As I said earlier, it has 101 short chapters, and it's endlessly fascinating. So I'm going to request Shashi to read 2 short passages, which I like, and then if there's stuff that you want to read beyond that, please do, to give everyone here a flavor of the book. The first one has to do with people like yourself who are besotted with words. So perhaps you can read the story about Robert Piroche.
Yes, that was going to be my selection as well, so I'll do that. By coincidence, without knowing that David wanted me to do that, I just found the page and I promptly lost it. 1 second. So when I talk about my obsession, as David quotes me as saying, I'm besotted with words, it's fair to say that I love them. But even I could not have expressed my love for words as well as a young job seeker called Robert Piroche did in 1934 when he headed to Hollywood looking for a new career as a screenwriter. Piroche was working in advertising in New York and had no connections in the American film industry. But he collected the names and addresses of as many directors, producers, and studio executives as he could find, and he sent them this brilliant letter. Dear sir, I like words. I like fat, buttery words, such as ooze, turpitude, glutinous, toady. I like solemn, angular, creaky words, such as straight-laced, cantankerous, pecunious, valedictory. I like spurious, black-as-white words, such as mortician, liquidate, tonsorial, demi-monde. I like suave V words, such as Svengali, svelte, bravura, verve. I like crunchy, brittle, crackly words, such as splinter, grapple, jostle, crusty. I like sullen, crabbed, scowling words, such as skulk, glower, scabby, churl. I like, oh heavens, my gracious landsake words, such as tricksy, tucker, genteel, horrid. I like elegant, flowery words, such as estivate, peregrinate, elysium, halcyon. I like wormy, squirmy, mealy words, such as crawl, blubber, squeal, drip. I like sniggly, chuckling words, such as cowlick, gurgle, bubble, and burp. I like the word screenwriter better than copywriter. So I decided to quit my job in New York, in a New York advertising agency and try my luck in Hollywood. But before taking the plunge, I went to Europe for a year of study, contemplation, and horsing around. I have just returned, and I still like words. May I have a few with you? So many would concede that no better job application has ever been written in the English language, and I would add no better paean to the marvels and joys of words either. The letter worked. Pirosh landed 3 job interviews, one of which led to a job as a junior writer at Metro Goldwyn Mayer Studios, the fabled MGM. His career soared. In 1949, remember the letter was written in 1934, 15 years later, screenwriter Robert Pirosh won an Academy Award Oscar for Best Original Screenplay for his work on the war film Battleground. A few months after the Oscar, he also won a Golden Globe Award from the Hollywood Foreign Press Association. These were opportunities he might never have landed if he had not loved words enough to craft such a brilliant letter. But what about the words he used in this letter? Many of them might have escaped your comprehension. So in tribute to Pirosh, here's a cheat sheet to the several unusual or difficult words he cited, just in case you fall in love with them too. And I'll omit those words that I expect most of you to be familiar with already. In order of appearance, turpitude describes wicked or depraved behavior or character. It's common to speak of someone being guilty of moral turpitude. Glutinous simply means sticky. Pecunious is a fancy way of saying wealthy. There's no good reason to use either when such easy alternatives exist. On the other hand, tonsorial is an unusual word for the work of a barber. It means giving shaves and haircuts. The demi-monde refers to a group of people on the fringes of respectable society, prostitutes, for instance, though the term is also used these days for anyone whose activities you don't particularly approve of, like arms merchants or moneylenders. A Svengali, based on a fictional character, is a person who exercises a controlling or mesmeric and usually sinister influence on another. A person or thing is described as scabby when it is very unpleasant or unappealing. A churl is a rude and mean-spirited person, someone whose tricksy is playful or mischievous. To estivate is to spend a hot or dry period in a prolonged state of torpor or dormancy. To peregrinate is to travel or wander from place to place. Elysium is paradise, the abode of the blessed. The halcyon days were a period in the past that was idyllically happy and peaceful. And then Pirosh threw in a curveball, a word that doesn't exist, sniggly. To sniggle is to fish for eels by thrusting a baited hook into their hiding places. But he simply made up sniggly. Word lovers do that. They invent some too. Read on for more.
So one more reading before we, throw open the floor to questions, because we are coming to the end of our.
I'm sure the audience will have to ask questions.
Time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I wondered if you might sort of read the first few paragraphs from the chapter "Crash Blossoms," which is on page 83, because that's quite fun.
Okay. Some of these only work in writing. I don't know if they'll work very well read aloud, but I'll try.
Okay. Well, if there's something else you'd like to read,
the Indian English.
Yeah,
chapter?
sure.
Yeah. So that might be something that will be familiar to folks here. Page 18, yeah. The crash blossoms, by the way, relate to headlines of newspapers, but it tends to be funnier when you see it in print and you see how the mistake could be made. So that's why. Is that right?
Yeah.
Indianisms. I've long immodestly considered myself the inventor of the term prepone. I came up with it at St. Stephen's in 1972, used it extensively in conversation, and employed it in an article in JS magazine soon after. Prepone, as a back construction from postpone, seemed so much simpler to a teenage collegian than clunkily saying, could you move that appointment earlier, or I would like to advance that deadline, or please bring it forward to an earlier date. Over the years, I was gratified to see how extensively its use had spread in India. But I was wrong. In keeping with the long-standing wisdom that there is nothing new under the sun, I was told by Catherine Henstridge of the Oxford English Dictionary, no less, that they have an example of the use of the word prepone from 1913 in the New York Times. It didn't catch on much in the West, but that was in a letter to the editor of the New York Times. It didn't catch on much in the West, but the proceedings of the 1952 Indian Science Congress revealed that other Indians thought along the same lines as me. In Indian villages, quote unquote, demand for power can be preponed or postponed not only by hours but even by days. So clearly the origin of prepone had been preponed from 1972 to 1913, and I duly withdraw my claim to its origination. Mind you, I can still make a case through frequent usage for being somewhat involved in its popularization. Still, the persistence and survival of what's called Indian English, often with a sneer as if to differentiate it from the Queen's proper English, or the King's now, deserves to be taken seriously. Our English spoken without the shadow of Englishman looming over us is a vigorous and local language which draws strength from local roots. If Americans can say fall for autumn and gotten for have got, though both are archaisms in England itself, why can't Indians say furlong, fortnight, and do the needful, even if these have fallen out of use centuries ago in London? So many words in Indian English, including prepone, have stood up to the only test that matters, the test of time and usage. If enough people find a word or phrase useful, it is, to my mind, legitimate. Indian English is a living, practical language used by millions every day for practical purposes. I'm not referring to expressions like satyagraha, namaste, or yogi that have passed into the English language and are used exactly as they are in India. I'm referring to the usage of English words differently in India from the Anglophone West. Many phrases we take for granted in ordinary conversations are quite unusual abroad. Calling elders auntie or uncle, for instance, or using the expression non-veg to convey willingness to eat meat. That doesn't make them wrong or even quaint, it just makes them Indian. Some Indian English was created by our media and passed into regular usage. Air dash, the Chief Minister air dashed to Delhi. History sheeter, the police explained that habitual criminal X was a history sheeter, i.e. that he had a long criminal record. Some, like my prepone, came from school and college campuses. Mugging, cramming hard for an exam with much rote learning and memorization involved, uses a word that means two very different things to Americans or Brits abroad. To Americans, it's a criminal assault by a robber, as in she was the victim of a mugging in a dark alley. In India, we say mugging when we study for an exam, right? Or, in Britain particularly, it's an elaborate or often comically exaggerated expression, as in he was mugging for the camera. You make a funny expression for the camera, you're mugging. We don't use the mugging in that way in India. When an Indian student tells a foreigner that he was mugging for an exam, bewilderment is guaranteed. Yet it's a vivid word that conveys exactly what is intended for every user of Indian English. So the way Indians speak the English language is often distinctive, but not necessarily incorrect. Some Indian Englishisms are merely translated from an Indian language. What is your good name is the classic, since all Bengalis, for instance, have a dark naam that they're called by, and a bhalo naam or good name for the record. So that's why what is your good name? But what is your good name is still the most polite form in almost any Indian version of the English language for finding out the identity of your interlocutor. Is he your real brother, someone asks? Not to accuse you of having imaginary siblings, but to differentiate this brother from a cousin who's also referred to as a brother by affectionate Indians. That's a cultural assumption, and such cultural assumptions inevitably influence language. The widespread preference for, or at least acceptability of, vegetarianism in India makes Indian English the only language that uses the expression non-veg for meat, fish, and those who consume them. The Indian arranged marriage culture has also had its impact on our local English. Our matrimonial ads have created their own cultural tropes with expressions that only mean something in Indian English. Wheatish complexion, of course. And better still, traditional with modern outlook. Many ads require a prospective bride in India to be homely, that is, home-loving and a good housekeeper. Now, you know that homely in the West means rather plain-looking, but that's not what they mean in India, right? Home-loving and a good housekeeper. And to have passed out, not fainted or lost consciousness, as a Brit or an American might assume, but graduated from a convent school. In other words, a school established by a missionary order where the medium of instruction is English. Some Indianisms are creative uses of ordinary English words or phrases to reflect a particularly Indian sensibility, such as kindly adjust, said apologetically by the seventh person slipping onto a bench meant for four. We have nothing to apologize about. We should definitely defiantly celebrate their use as integral parts of our Indian English vocabulary. After all, we are like that only. And if you don't like it, kindly adjust. But acknowledging the legitimacy of Indian English and many of its formulations doesn't mean that anything goes. Some things are simply wrong. The Indian habit of saying, I will return back, is an unnecessary redundancy. If you return, you're coming back. I'm more neutral about revert as an Indianism for get back. A correspondent saying, I will revert to you by next week, does not mean, as the English or Americans will think, that he will convert himself into what you used to be. Merely that he will issue a reply. I will revert to you by next week literally means I'll change into who you are, you know. But in India we mean it differently. Since the meaning is clear, objections to its use are unwarranted. But the Desi practice of using till to mean as long as is simply incorrect English. It is wrong to say, I will miss you till you are away, when you really mean, I will miss you till you come back. I'm staying Bandra side is not an acceptable equivalent. I'm living in the Bandra area. And backside for rear causes much unwitting hilarity, as in signs proclaiming entry through backside only. These can't be justified under the rubric of Indian English. They are just bad English. Indians are excessively fond of euphemisms. We would rather use a roundabout way of conveying an interest in a delicate topic rather than use the direct word that foreign English speakers might. Thus we use reduced as a synonym for losing weight. You've reduced? Your intended. That is, your intended spouse is your would-be in India. A loose character has dubious morals. Women speak of chums for menstrual periods. Chum is an old English slang for pal and must have been applied since those chums are monthly visitors. Asking about good news is a polite way of inquiring about pregnancy. And we speak of issues when we mean children. You've been married for 10 years, any issues? Doesn't mean do you have problems in your marriage, but do you have any children? Cultural assumptions and practices are inevitably reflected in Indian English. You belong to your native place rather than being simply from there. And your native place might be a mofussil town, that is a rural or provincial area. If you're not in town, you're out of station. If you meet a lady who's elder to you, she's usually auntie even if there is no blood relationship. Relationships matter in India, and so terms are invented for which there is no English equivalent. Thus, your co-brother is your wife's sister's spouse. There is even a term going back to the days when travel beyond our shares was a rare and inordinately expensive privilege for someone who had come back after sojourning abroad. They were foreign returned. And a unique Indian cultural practice gave us the expression, give me a missed call. Meaning, ring me briefly and hang up so your number shows up on my device and I will call you back at my expense when I'm free. The caller might be an impecunious relative who can't afford to pay for the call, or merely a junior who would be seen as presumptuous otherwise. The missed call addresses both these handicaps. Then there are Indian formulations that have nothing to do with cultural sensitivities, but simply reflect the way we apply certain words. You're sometimes required to do the needful. If you do it perfectly, you've achieved 10%, and your friend's thanks is met with mention not, rather than don't mention it. We have a noun, time pass, for activities to while away one's idle moments. We take lunch rather than have lunch. See a picture rather than a movie. Put up somewhere rather than stay there. What foreigners call sunglasses are often cooling glasses, goggles or glares in India. We ask for a cold drink when we want what Americans call soda, and the pompous referred to as an aerated beverage, though the drink may not in fact be cold. Some Indian English expressions emerge from translating phrases in local languages, like eating my head for bothering me, sit on her head for pressure, I took his class, for I scolded him. Others are more modern. An unfamiliar problem is out of syllabus. A good experience is first class. Then there's rubber as a synonym for erase. In the US, a rubber is what you use in bed to prevent a mistake. In the US, you use it in the classroom after you make one. Of course, some Indianisms are just awkward and arguably wrong, like God promise and mother promise to swear upon the divine or your mother, or saying years back rather than years ago. The telephone has brought about other solecisms. Hello, Ramu this side, when you mean Ramu here, or the stranger on the line who says, myself Salman, yourself? I'm tempted to say myself gone and cut the call, that is hang up. So that's the spirit of the book. Enjoy.
That is brilliant, Shashi. Thank you so much. We have about 10 minutes for questions, so if anyone would like to ask questions, please do so now. That gentleman over there.
Good evening, sir. Am I audible?
Yeah, you're here. You're audible.
Okay. So my name is Promit Lahiri. I'm a land.
Yeah, it does kind of break up. The sound is going in and out. Maybe if you come a little closer, perhaps you're too close to the speaker there. That may be why it's breaking. Yeah, thanks. Try.
Is it better now?
Yeah, could be. Try.
Okay. So my name is. It's still breaking. Actually.
No, it's not much better. There's another mic coming to you. Sorry, that mic is obviously a problem.
Loud and clear. Okay. So my name is Promit Lahiri. I'm a LAM fellow, sir.
Oh, hi. So, okay. A lamp is somebody who, not Florence Nightingale with the lamp, but somebody who's a legislative assistant to an MP. So you're working with some MP. Great. Yeah.
So, sir, thank you so much for the talk. It was very nice.
Pleasure.
I actually wanted to know because as a Bengali, we tend to use a lot of onomatopoeias. So
Right.
What is your thought on the use of onomatopoeia?
It's in many Indian languages, certainly in Hindi as well. No? You often use a rhyming word to go with something. Onomatopoeia, of course, refers to the sounds of that you're talking about, and that's there in English as well. But again, it can't always literally translate, right? And it's interesting that the one Indian writer who actually tried to reflect some of these Indian styles in English in occasional passages is Salman Rushdie. So he would constantly, say, I can't now think off the top of my head about a Rushdieism, but something like, what is all this Lakshmak you're having? Or, what is, are you in a good mood, should? This kind of thing. That's very typically, in many Indian languages, this echoing sounds to convey something and to reinforce a point. Give me a couple of examples of Bangla onomatopoeia. Hore Baba. Okay. Bhobash. It said. That's it. Okay. So, I mean, most Indian languages have a certain musicality of their own, but these are untranslatable. So in English, English has onomatopoeia, and so, bang, for example, is onomatopoeia, the sound of a bullet shot. Earl Stanley Gardner, when he wrote the Perry Mason books, was always asked why whenever there was any firing in his books, it'd be bang, 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 and not just bang. And he would say, because it's 10 cents a word. Thanks.
The lady in a checked.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Actually, I have a question which is not exactly related to English, but rather about reading. As a reader myself, I often face a problem once I'm reading a text. I tend to associate it with the moral character of the writer. Like, for example, the writer you mentioned, Woodhouse. And to add a few more to the mix, like Virginia Woolf, Kant, maybe Wilde, remarkably different range of writers, but still they seem to have a convenient distaste for the Indian subcontinent, and they somehow use certain allusions in their writing, like flimsy, pretty nincompoofs for Indian women, and inhabitants of the southern oceans to be considered lazy, as Kant once put. I don't remember the exact quotation. So do you believe that as readers ourselves, we should hold in contempt for such things, and consider it to be a rather philosophical interplay between morality, or just to take them for their written word and that.
I'm not sure I caught it all. Did you catch that fully? Just give me a
She's
paraphrase.
talking about
No, it was
the
obvious.
way certain writers depict stereotypical, supposed stereotypes, right? And what is your point?
It's not your fault. The sound system somehow hasn't quite traveled all the way here. Something about the interplay of moralities. Where was the interplay coming between?
If they're using certain terms or wordings like inhabitants of the southern ocean to be considered lazy as Kant once wrote, should we take
That's why I
them
didn't
as
hear.
attempt for it, or should we take them just for the written word, for the mere beautiful nature of conveying these words in the literature, or be more philosophical and think about the moral implications that such words carry? And
Well, she was talking about Woodhouse and Kant and Wilde, I think, and she was basically saying they were reflecting certain prejudices and so on. Should we read the...
Yeah, sorry, I see your point. I'm really sorry the audibility was a challenge for me up here on stage. Writers reflect the era in which they were writing. And they often used words at a certain era which were not meant to be offensive, but which would offend us today. Now, there are two ways you can do it. There are some publishers who have started reissuing these earlier texts in sort of expurgated editions. And I don't like that, personally. That's a personal choice. I want the books to be true to the words used by the writer at that time themselves. And it's up to me to make an allowance for whether the writer's overall content and sensibility demonstrates that he did not intend to cause offense. I can make that determination myself. Whereas there will be some people who use those words, even at a later era, in order to offend. And there is a difference. I don't know how many of you, for example, grew up as I did reading Enid Blyton's children's stories. Now, the Noddy books, right, in Toyland, they're two. There's a gollywog, right, who's a black character and who's doing bad things most of the time, right? And that is a stereotype that's pretty meant to be disparaging. I have never felt that it influenced my attitude to black people. I just thought of it as a character in a story that was bad. There was, in the famous Five, there was a girl character who always wanted to be a boy. I think Georgina or Georgette, who called herself George and tried to... And I didn't see that as gender stereotyping or, in fact, challenging a gender stereotype. I just saw that as a distinctive trait of a particular character. So I don't need somebody else coming in and rewriting these things to eliminate things that might offend me. Let me decide for myself if I'm offended. That's my view. I accept that a different reader might be offended. For example, there are some words used for black people in books written in the 20s and before, which are simply not considered acceptable words today, which would in fact, invite opprobrium if somebody used them today. But that was not the case when they were written, and clearly they were used with some innocence, because the rest of the person's writing does not show any racism or any hostility or whatever. And then you're talking about a humorist. So if I read a line from Woodhouse, he very rarely gets into politics, by the way, but there is one of the very few lines in which he mentions India is when he says, one of his characters rather says, what's all this nonsense about civil disobedience? The problem with this Mahatma Gandhi is he only eats nuts and milk. Let him sit down to a good steak and roly-poly pudding and we'll see the end of all this rebellion nonsense. Now, this is a silly comment, but he wasn't a racist. He wasn't trying to put Mahatma Gandhi down. He just had a character who thought he was being witty in that particular context. Now, why would I be offended by that? I admire Mahatma Gandhi and there are other things I read about Mahatma Gandhi. This is not going to determine my judgment of him. So bottom line, it's up to you, but my own view is let the works remain the way they were written and conceived. Just as a fact can become out of date, a word can become out of date in usage and context. I mean, think of the way the word gay was used until the 1960s. It didn't mean what it means today. It just meant, somebody high-spirited, jolly, having a good time is gay. Now, if you go back to those books, you might get confused if the only meaning you know of gay is that of a homosexual, and vice versa. So accept that. certain books, words, contexts, writings are true to their time, and take that in stride.
The gentleman, the black, blue T-shirt.
Good evening, Dr. Tharoor.
Hi.
My name is Shashi Tharoor, and I am the neighbor of Mr. Rashi. He's from Solon, and I'm from Solon. They call me Marshall. Sir, you have mentioned in your book, The Battle of Belonging, where you talk about language in particular. So there you say that any language which is suitable for Sharma and Shukla and not for Subramanian or Reddy, that cannot be the national language of this country, and I do agree to that particular point. Now, sir, as today we are talking about language, we are talking about the importance, I would just like to know, language does play a very important role in the nationalistic sentiments. It's a form of nationalism. But as in this fast-moving world, or we see this as a global village, how far or what is the role of India to formulate English and also to make a balance of the same with the regional identities, the cultural identities, or the regional languages? Because what I feel is that when we talk about language and preserving the language and enhancing it, only cannot be done based on the idea of cultural identity or regionalism. It also requires employment in the same field. So how far can we come to construct a proper roadmap in that regard, sir?
Well, look, I mean, there is no question that that nationalism was expressed in multiple languages, but that for many, the unifying language of Indian nationalism was English, because that was the language in which Nehru could write and be understood by Rajaji in Tamil Nadu, by Bose in Bengal, by, you know, the equivalent leaders in other states, simply because that language happened to have the merit of not being affiliated with one particular region of the country. It had the disadvantage or the demerit of being associated with the educated elite of the English medium backgrounds, but it was not regionally limited. Now, that didn't prevent excellent nationalist writing in regional languages. Bengali, in fact, the original language of Indian nationalism arguably was Bangla, because the first texts articulating Indian nationalism came out of the Bengali press, and many a Bengali newspaper was banned by the British and so on because of that. The problem in today's India is that the fact that we have now reorganized our states on linguistic lines has made language a vehicle of regionalism in a certain way. I wouldn't say that it undermines national unity, but it certainly makes it more of a challenge. For example, in my state of Kerala, it used to be jokingly said that you know the largest number of Indians who were fluent in English, at least until 8 p.m. was Kerala. After 8 p.m. it was Punjab, but that's another matter. But the fact is that there was an extraordinary amount of fluency, and a lot of Malayalis found jobs all over India in the National Secretariat in Delhi and so on and so forth because of their assumed comfort level with English. Today, in today's Kerala, most people wake up in the morning listening to the news in Malayalam. They turn on the radio and entertain in Malayalam. They turn on TV and watch stuff in Malayalam. They see movies in Malayalam. They speak to people in Malayalam. And as a result, their English fluency has declined considerably. And that is only possible because Kerala is no longer a multilingual state. In the days of up to 1956, you had Kerala, you had Tamil in the south, you had Kannada in the north, you had English, and very often English could be used in the state assembly and so on. That's disappeared now. It's all become Malayalam-centered. And I imagine the same is true in many, many other states. Now, that linguistic pride mixed with regional consciousness will certainly be, can certainly become an issue that fuels sometimes a sense of separation. And it's paradoxical that in a world in which we're being more easily knit together with ease of travel, ease of communications and everything else, that language could become a force for division. Maybe AI will come to our rescue. And it won't matter that you only speak Malayalam or you only speak Tamil, because you say something and the Bengali can quickly hear you on AI and get a translation in 1 second. Maybe that'll be the solution. I don't know. But that is a point well worth making.
The gentleman in the red shirt.
You need to alternate gender so you're not being sexist.
Thank you. This was an enlightening art, especially the beginning where you mentioned reading for pleasure. I would like to quote Woodhouse, it's an all-time favorite book I was reading. As we grow older and realize more clearly the limitations of human happiness, we come to see that the only real and abiding pleasure in life is to give pleasure to other people. So I'm the founder of a project which helps people build a better reading habit and explore the joys of reading, especially for pleasure. What are a couple of ways you suggest we could go about our mission based on your experience as a reader, a lifelong reader?
You mean of giving happiness to others?
In the form of reading.
Oh, in the form of reading, yeah.
The pleasures of reading solely.
Okay. I was going to say that it's a very vast subject otherwise, yeah. But when it comes to reading, I would say one thing certainly is to know about the person you're recommending something to as to what moves their cheese, as the expression goes. Now, what is it that they enjoy? So if somebody enjoys humor, then recommend them good, funny books. And there are lots more out there than people realize. I mean, after I exhausted Woodhouse's oeuvre, I was in despair that I'd never find a comic writer to match. And I tried the whole lot of British comic writers of the 50s and the later ones. In fact, the later ones are much worse. But anyway, and then I came across an amazing Swedish novel in translation in English called The 100-Year-Old Man Who Jumped Out of a Window and Disappeared. And it's the most incredibly funny book. And I thought, gosh, comic writing is alive. And I've been recommending it left, right, and center to friends and on Twitter. So people who see my tweets may have gone out and read it and got the pleasure out of that. If somebody else gets pleasure out of beautiful poetry, there's lots of great poets you can recommend. If there's somebody who gets pleasure out of being immersed in completely invented worlds, a Garcia Marquez novel, for example, has few parallels. I mean, you can go on and on and on with, but you must know who you're speaking to. The same person who enjoys a Woodhouse may not enjoy a Garcia Marquez, though I loved both. But I'm just saying that it depends on what they want. So if you know your target audience, lots of books to impart pleasure of various kinds.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for 3 more questions. This lady.
Good evening, sir. I am Bipasha Shukla, and I'm currently studying English literature in Delhi University. And also, I'm aspiring to become a writer also. But sometimes I go out of topics. I just wanted to ask, how do you find a topic to write? Because there is a book on every topic. So.
I think you'll be surprised that there are still books that people haven't written about. Has anyone written a book about finding a book that's not on a topic that already exists, for example? There's a topic for you. No, I mean, jokes apart, I think each of us has our own sensibilities, our own way of looking at things. So you should choose something that interests you, that means something to you, that you want to convey to your readers. And as long as you have that desire to do it, it doesn't matter if somebody else has plowed the same terrain, because you're bound to do it differently. Because it's your thoughts, your experiences, your sensibility, and your choice of words, all of which will be different from what somebody else has written on the same subject. I mean, you may be right that broadly speaking, there's almost nothing new under the sun, but nonetheless, the way you do it is unique to you. I honestly feel the way we write is as about us as the way we think, the way we speak. So why should it be no one else speaks like me or writes like me? No one else ever done the same as you. And even if it's the same topic, so what? Find your own way of expressing it. Okay? Yes. But write about things that matter to you, because then it'll be much more authentic, much more real.
Thank you so much, sir.
Lady in white.
Thank you, Anushri, this side.
Hi.
It was very engaging. You always have a way with words. And you were kind enough to launch my first book, receive my first book in your Lodi State Office, Love, Lost and Found.
Right.
And I couldn't put this question up there because, again, I was lost in your words. I read somewhere, or I heard you in an interview, you said you set a target to read 365 books in 365 days. Was it achievable? I mean, how did it go? Do you not have like...
I don't recommend it. And I never did it again. No, it was a silly challenge I set myself when I was 13 or something. I have no idea why I must. Somebody must have planted the thought, or I may have read somewhere that somebody had done something like that, or had done 100 books in 100 days, and I decided I would beat that person, do 365. I don't remember anymore. But I did keep a diary, and I finished 365 before Christmas. But I realized it's absurd to read for a deadline, against a deadline. Read for pleasure. Because if you're reading just to finish, you will end up essentially losing some of the joy that reading gives you. And that to me is ultimately far more important. So not only did I never do that again, but I discourage anybody who has any such crazy idea. I mean, as it is in life, one is always reading to deadlines, schoolwork, homework, preparing for exams, you're reading to a deadline. So when you're reading for pleasure, let deadlines not come in the way. Read in the pace that appeals to you, put it aside and you go back. I mean, the most moving story I ever heard about one of my own writing is that there was a lady who was dying of cancer in South Africa who was reading the great Indian novel. This is a story I was told by a relative of hers soon after the book came out. And she loved it so much, she would deliberately put aside after a few pages every night, believing that that will to go back to the book would wake her up the next morning. And the sad story, I mean, the great story, she did finish the book. The sad story is very soon after she passed away. And I heard the story from this relative and I just moved to tears. But there's something that tells you about how even the pace at which you read a book can be. That anecdote is not in my book. Since you asked the question, it came to me. And even the pace at which you read can influence what something means to you and to your life. So don't read to a deadline ever. And it was a silly thing I did, and I now wish I'd never talked about it, because by talking about it, everyone knows, and there are too many parents are telling their kids, he read 365 books in one day, you can do the same. Please don't. Yeah.
One last question. I'm going to take that side, so that gentleman over there.
Good evening, sir. So my name is Yash. Sir, it's a fairly established fact that one's accent can be attributed to one's milieu, natural surroundings, etc. So where did you acquire that peculiar accent of yours? And is it somewhat a byproduct of your extensive readings, if I may ask?
No, obviously reading doesn't give you an accent, though it gives you a hyper confidence to wield the words. I honestly learned it from an education in India. And I know people find that odd, but I went to a school called Campion School in Bombay as a very young child. And not only were the teachers all speaking like this, but we had elocution contests and classes where you basically won by speaking like this. So I did. And I won. And then I must say at St. Stephen's College, in my time, 72 to 5, I was completely surrounded by people who spoke like this. Of course, there were others who spoke in other ways. But to this day, my contemporaries, one of them is sitting here, I would not find it very unusual, because I spoke like this there also. This is simply, and not just me, I can name half a dozen others who spoke even more sort of, if the implication is there's something anglicized about it, that was simply the English that we were taught by and that were used by our teachers, because that was the way they had been taught by the English. And now we were no longer being taught by English, but we were taught by Indians who were pretty good at imitating English. And I think it's because I had a fairly good ear, I was blessed with that I was able to speak like that. But once I got stuck in this habit, when I went to America for graduate school, stayed there 3 years, and when I stayed there again later as an adult, I never picked up the American accent because I was set in my way of speaking. So I never said path and class and stuff like that. I just, I remember when I was first in graduate school and I asked for a tomato, the lady very helpfully said to me, don't say that in this country, it sounds affected. You have to say tomato. I said, but the word is tomato. She said, no, the word is tomato. So then I realized, all right, in America, if I want to get a tomato, I better say tomato. But jokes apart, that apart, the way you speak is ultimately who you are, and you leave it that way. And I've stuck to that, and I've spoken the same way since my college days to today. And I'm proud to say that when I speak French, my French is not very accented, and my Hindi, I hope, is passable to all of you, and my Malayalam gets away with it. I got elected 4 times with speeches in Malayalam. So it's just, it's the language comes, if you've got a good ear, in the way in which you've picked it up. And that's the English I learned.
Okay, at Shashi's request, we're going to have somebody from this side. This gentleman in a check shirt.
So very good evening. Fairly a very simple question. I just wanted to know, sir, whether you are the one who writes the title of your book, or is it some copywriter? Just out of curiosity.
No, actually, usually I come up with my own titles, but the publisher does have a final say, and there's some back and forth. So this one was by mutual creation, I would say. A Battle of Belonging, I'm proud to say, was my own. An Era of Darkness, we went back and forth. I started off with A Long Darkness. We were neither of us totally convinced by that. And then it suddenly struck me, since everyone knew a Naipaul's An Area of Darkness, why not a word that echoed that? So I came up with An Era of Darkness. The idea of darkness was there, but the Era of Darkness came that way. And then when the British publisher said, no, this title doesn't work, we're going to call it bluntly what you're writing about, Inglorious Empire. So in the British and American and foreign editions, it's known as Inglorious Empire, but in India, it's An Era of Darkness. So the publisher does have a fairly strong say. And I must say that most of my books, the publisher and I have agreed fairly quickly. Bookless in Baghdad was my title. Nehru, the Invention of India was my title. Ambedkar, I didn't know what title to adopt. And the British publisher had a very unwielding title, the Ambedkar, the man who gave hope to India's dispossessed. And David simply said, Ambedkar, a life. And that's what it is in India. So again, there are differences sometimes in different editions, but certainly the Indian titles have to be by mutual agreement. The publisher has to market the book. So if he thinks the author has come up with a title they just won't sell, he'll tell him so, right? There you are.
Thank you so much, sir.
Wow, okay. We had planned to stop at 8 o'clock, so 3 minutes more if you want to shout out your question or give
Okay, there's this very forceful lady, so over to you.
Are there any words that you have secretly introduced into the English language that we are not aware of? Could you share with us?
No, after I claimed credit for prepone and discovered I hadn't done it, I'll forget about that. No, I enjoy it. Yes, there are a couple of words in the great Indian novel, which, and one or two in my stories earlier, which actually don't exist, and which never got repeated by anybody else, so they haven't gone into any dictionary. So I can't claim I introduced them into the language, but I think writers enjoy playing with words, and they'll come up with something or the other, and some usage. The words I did come up with are not polite enough to be mentioned in public, so I'll leave that. But they weren't. You see, a word only comes into currency when more than one person uses it, and there were words throughout the very fecund years of the 18th century. Writers were inventing words all the time, but 95% of those words died with them. No one ever repeated or used them. Some words did get used and got picked up, and others used them, and that's why they entered the language. Shakespeare gets the credit for the most words and expressions that no one else had used before, and I think I have an essay on that. I know I've written one somewhere, so maybe in the book too, on how words came into the language from some famous writers and who invented how many words. And Shakespeare is way ahead of most. But then others invent words and people don't use them, but they don't use them in the sense in which the word was invented. And there's some examples of that too in the book.
Okay, I'm sorry, we've got to...
Yes, he's come all the way from Allahabad, so we have to... Lucknow, I beg your pardon, from Lucknow.
Just a quick one on a very light note. It's been very entertaining, very enlightening. I would like to know your view. Is Indian Englishism acceptable to you? Indian Englishism acceptable to you?
Yes, as I said in the extract I read out earlier, I think some of it is. I think it's just as distinctive as Australian English or American English or whatever. But in some cases, the Englishisms are simply bad English, and I've given examples of that also. So we have to have, there's a difference between using an expression that other countries don't use, which is a legitimate place in the language, and using an expression that is simply bad English because it doesn't mean what you think it means.
So by and large, it's acceptable for someone like you. It is acceptable.
Yeah, for me, a lot of it, I live with it, I live amidst it. I use it and I have it used towards me, so how can I turn right?
Thank you. Thank
you.
Good.
Okay, we're going to turn this over now to Harshita, and Shashi will be signing books briefly.
Should I just sit here and sign, or there a desk outside?
Where is he going to be? Where is he going to sign?
There's a desk outside?
Outside, yes.
Okay. See you all outside if you want the book. And thanks, that was fun. You can have a very sort of clever, literary, witty writing, like the writing of Woodhouse, which is laugh out loud English, and at the same time it's extremely sophisticated, literary, full of allusions to the classics and the Bible and God knows what else, which you may or may not catch, but it's there, embedded in the language. So you can use language effectively for whatever effect you want to bring about. It may be to persuade, it may be to convince people of an argument, it may be to say something outrageous, it may be just to make people laugh. But language is an effective instrument of doing all of that and more. And to my mind, that's very important. So I think, I know that I've got this completely sort of inflated reputation as some sort of vocabularist. I mean, when you first suggested this book, my question in my mind was, do I really want to sort of reinforce this cliched image of me as some sort of etymological egghead, and this sort of MP who's more concerned with words than anything else? It's not true. I'm only concerned with words because they're my instruments. In politics, to my mind, are about ideas, and ideas are about words. So how can a politician be indifferent to words? That was my logic. But having said that, the book does have that message that, you know, use words and use them to effect and for a purpose, and in a way that actually gives you the results that you seek. That's the broad underlying thrust of what I'm trying to do.
You make a very specific point when you say, people come to you and say, teach us some new words. Yeah. What is your response?
My response is, my favorite word is a four-letter word, read. Because ultimately, as I explained to you earlier, that's how I acquired my words, and I think anybody will acquire whatever vocabulary they need by just reading, and that's what's essential, is to get into the habit of reading. It distresses me when I see young people today, and there are quite a few young people who are old enough to have kids of their own, and the kids tend to think, very frankly, that books are all about school and classroom work and homework. They're a chore, they're a burden, they're an obligation, they're not a source of pleasure. And that, to my mind, is a huge mistake, because in fact, they are, to my mind, principally a source of pleasure, and pleasure is what should really, really matter. To my mind, if children realize how much joy they can get out of coming across words in a book, it might be a very different experience for them than seeing books only as text. The irony is, of course, kids are reading, but they're reading off a mobile screen. They're probably not reading enough. They're not reading very good prose or very good text, but they're reading. So that if they can know how to read, they should really enjoy the process of the mind-expanding, mental horizon-expanding experience of reading more than just off a screen.
But don't you also argue that reading skills are the foundation for full participation in the economic, political, cultural life of contemporary society?
Yeah.
So how does that work besides, just entertainment?
Because in any society, the language of that society, or in our case, the languages of our society, are indispensable tools to taking command of your own destiny within that society. I mean, you have to fill in forms all the time for one thing, so that that the written word already fits into the governmental system. But there's also the fact that if you actually look at the way in which language is used by our rulers to communicate certain ideas and convictions, you ought to have the capacity to either absorb, deflect, or reflect on the language that's being thrust at you. You need language back to express your own agreement or disagreement. You need language to be able to deal with everything. The economy, yes, because the decisions you make have to be well informed, and information comes to you through language. If it's a question of social change, how are you aware of what goes on in other countries? You read about them, and then that brings you the insights to be able to say what kind of changes you would like to see in our own society. And of course, in politics, as I say, language and words are indispensable for political ideas. So in all those areas, economic, social, cultural, political, words, language, indispensable.
Okay, coming back to the fun aspect of the book, and I hope you'll read a little later so that you give us a flavor of what's in it. You talk about words fostering a sense of belonging and between all those who love them. There's a specific word you use, which is milver. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, Milva's got the great merit of being the only word a poet can use to rhyme with silver. Can any of you think of any other word that rhymes with silver? There isn't, right? The word Milva was invented by an American essayist and critic in the early years of the 20th century, because he said there is no English word that exists to describe a person who is enthusiastic about the same thing as you are enthusiastic about. And so he felt co-enthusiast or fellow fan, which are the only alternatives, were too cumbersome or just not appealing enough. And so he invented the word Milva, and not very clear what the etymology of it is, what the origins of it are, but he says that one needs to have a word to describe relationships that lovers of books and words have with other lovers of books and words. So I've written in the book that I think my father was probably my Milva, but the truth is that it's an epitome in some ways of the boundless possibilities that come when you explore language. You can even create new words just for fun. You can delve into words and wordplay, and it's a reminder of the endlessly inventive human capacity. Every year, some dictionary will be issuing a list of new words of the year, because those words have been coined